Okay, it's pizza time. I'm gonna make some pizza balls. So we're gonna need our scale. I already have my Caputo 00 flour. We need, I got my Madia right here. I got my dough ball box. We need some salt. What else I need? Regular Neapolitan, authentic Neapolitan dough does not have olive oil, but I actually sometimes do add a little olive oil because I've noticed that it softens up the crust, stays softer longer when I use it. So I do it sometimes, and I think I'm gonna do it for Sunday. Just add a little tiny bit. So I got my 2 scales. Oh, and I need my yeast, and I used SAF yeast. I've used fresh yeast, and that's what they recommend, but I've had really good results from this SAF. And I'll show you what it looks like. There you go. SAF or SAF, I don't know. One of the two. And then I need containers for my water. And I use a cold rice, so I use cold water, almost ice cold, to slow down the yeast. So I'm gonna get everything ready, and I'll be right back. Okay, I have all the ingredients measured out. I use a 65% hydration. So in this case, I measure it out so that I think I make about 4 or 5 pizza balls at 250 grams a piece. I use, of course, the weight of the flour would be 100%. I use a 3% salt. I use 0.54% SAF yeast. That's what over the last couple of years I've worked on this, and that's what gives me the best results right now. At least now at this time, it changes a little bit with the temperature and your environment and all that good stuff. But so that's what's working for me right now. Is 0.54% instant yeast. I use when I use olive oil, I use 2%, and then the water is 65%. Cold, because I do a cold rice in the fridge, and I want to slow down the yeast, so I use cold water. I don't want to warm it up as I'm kneading it, so I try not to work too fast, so that it doesn't warm up the dough and start getting an early rise. And then when I use a starter, I add 10%, but right now I'm not using a starter. All right, so I start. Oh, and then I do it in my Madia. Why the Madia, or why the wood box? Well, my dad, when I was a little kid, still in Guatemala, my father had a bakery, and I remember memories as a kid of they're working the dough in these wooden boxes that later on I found out were called artesas. In Italy, they call them Madias, I guess. They use them in the old world. I don't know what the purpose was. I don't know if it's tradition or it's just what was convenient. I don't know that it does anything. But when I got into pizza, I noticed when I watched the videos that a lot of the Italians were using these things. So I thought maybe there's something to it. So I like woodworking. So I made myself a little Madia. Honestly, I don't know that it does anything, but I have it. So this is why I use it. All right, and so what I start with adding the water in the box, in the Madia, and then I add the salt, and it's going to be, the water is kind of cold, so it takes a little longer to dissolve all the salt, but I make sure I get all of that salt dissolved because if you have any grains there, it tends to kill the yeast. All right, so I get that going. In the meantime, I separate my flour into 2 containers, and in the smaller container, about 1/3 of the flour, I add the instant yeast, and I mix it in. If you have if you use fresh yeast, you go straight into the water. I've noticed a lot of the pizza makers, you know, they all have their own little style, but some of them will add some of the flour first and get a bit of a batter going, and then they add the salt. Or some of them get the batter going before they add the yeast. They say that you know, the yeast does better when it's around less salt or something like that. I go ahead and dissolve all my salt, and then I add a little bit of just of just the plain flour, and I get a little batter going. Use my hand, just a little bit here. Sometimes I just use a bowl, you know, but when I make a little bit more of a portion, a larger portion, then I use my box. Keep it traditional. All right, at this point, I go ahead and I start adding the flour with the yeast, work it in. Since I do a cold rise, the kneading doesn't have to be as intense. I don't have to knead it for as long a time, because you don't have to create that mechanical leavening, because it's gonna go, you know, it's gonna have a slow rise in the fridge, and the glutens will have plenty of time to get their work done with the yeast. So I'll show you. It won't be a long kneading period. I usually do like 15-20 minutes. Those guys usually do up to like 40 minutes of kneading when they do it by hand. If they do it by machine, I think they do like 10 or 15 minutes or something like that. All right. So basically, that's the... So just a few minutes in, this is what it looks like. I just added the oil. Again, traditional Neapolitan pizza does not have olive oil in it, but they recommend for the home use. And I don't know if it's because, you know, you're not using a professional oven. I don't know that it makes a difference, but I've heard several of those guys recommend that for home use, you add a little bit of olive oil, and I think it's because it adds a little softness to the crust, and I have noticed that. So I do lately. I have been using it. Sometimes I do make it just without the oil, and it comes out. It's good. It's probably just as good, but I do notice that the dough gets stiffer a little quicker, and so I've been using the oil. And again, it's just a little bit. Okay, I'll continue. Okay, once I'm at this point where most of the dough, I have pulled most of the dough out of the sides of the madia or the box, I go ahead and take it out, and I finish the kneading process on the counter. And usually I do it on my slab, because it keeps the temperature a little lower on my granite slab. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to do this. So then what I do is I leave a little bit of the flour. I go ahead and use the whole thing, but and then as I knead, because I go by feel now, I've gotten to the point where I can kind of tell when it's just right. And again, I don't go crazy on the kneading. What you don't want to do is tear through it. You know, you don't want to tear through those developing glutens. You do, you fold it on itself. You know, and everybody does it a little different, I think, but you don't want to tear those glutens. And so what I do is I slowly come into the flour until I'm at a point where it's still a little tacky, because again, I'm using a 65% hydration, so it'll be a little wetter dough. I've gone as high as 70%, but I like the 65%. Depending on the atmosphere, the atmospheric conditions, I've noticed sometimes I end up using a little less of the flour, and sometimes I end up adding a little bit if it's still a little too wet. You know, it changes with the environment, with the conditions. Those guys with all the experience they have, they can usually make the adjustments before they just touch their skin, and they could tell that it might be too humid, too dry, and they make the necessary adjustments. So then I go ahead and do this for about 15 minutes. I get it to a point where I feel that it's soft enough and it's not lumpy, get it a little smoother, and then I let it rest. I'll be back.